Across the world, there are structures older than history itself. Built without metal, machines, or written plans, they still shape the land thousands of years later. These were not accidents. They were deliberate choices made by people who understood stone, space, and time in ways we are only beginning to recognize. In this documentary, what remains in walls, platforms, and foundations. No myths, no speculation, only the quiet evidence left behind. Stay with it, and let the stones tell their story. La Quemada. La Quemada is located in the highlands of present-day Zacatecas, Mexico. Rising above a dry valley surrounded by low mountains, the terrain is rocky and uneven, with limited water sources and wide visibility across the surrounding land. Any long-term settlement here required planning, control of movement, and careful use of space. Archaeologically, the site is identified as La Quemada. Occupation is generally dated between 300 and 900 CE, placing La Quemada in a transitional zone between Mesoamerica and the northern arid regions. It does not fit neatly into any single cultural category. The settlement is built across a steep hillside rather than on flat ground. Architecture adapts to slope through extensive terracing. Stone retaining walls create level surfaces where buildings could be constructed and movement controlled. The most prominent feature of La Quemada is its monumental stone architecture. Large platforms, wide stairways, and massive walls dominate the site. Construction relied on roughly shaped stone blocks, fitted together without mortar. One of the central structures is the Hall of Columns, a long rectangular building defined by rows of stone pillars. These columns once supported a roof, creating an interior space capable of accommodating many people at once. The scale of this structure suggests organized gathering rather than domestic use. It was not a residence. It functioned as a communal or administrative space. Nearby platforms rise in stages, connected by stairways aligned along the slope. These stairs regulate movement upward, directing approach towards specific areas rather than allowing free circulation. Walls at La Quemada are thick and continuous. They define space clearly, separating functional zones and limiting access points. This emphasis on enclosure is unusual compared to earlier open ceremonial centers. The site shows strong concern with defense. Narrow entrances, elevated positions, and controlled pathways suggest that protection was a significant consideration. Unlike ceremonial centers built primarily for ritual, La Quemada combines administrative, ceremonial, and defensive elements within the same complex. There is no clear evidence of palaces or elite residences dominating the site. Authority appears embedded in architecture rather than expressed through individual buildings. Water management was critical. Cisterns and channels collected seasonal rainfall, allowing occupation despite limited natural sources. These systems required maintenance and coordination, reinforcing the idea of centralized organization. Residential areas are present but modest. Houses are smaller and less elaborate than the monumental core, indicating separation between daily life and institutional space. Material culture recovered from La Quemada includes pottery styles linked to central Mexico, as well as local traditions. This suggests interaction rather than isolation. Trade routes likely passed through the region, connecting northern resources with Mesoamerican centers further south. The site's location supports this role. Positioned on elevated ground, La Quemada could monitor movement through the valley. Despite its scale, La Quemada was not continuously occupied for many centuries. Evidence suggests periods of growth followed by decline. Signs of burning appear across parts of the site. Walls and structures show traces of fire, giving rise to the modern name La Quemada, meaning the burned place. Whether this burning resulted from conflict, ritual closure, or abandonment remains debated. There is no clear evidence of a single catastrophic event. Eventually, the site was abandoned. People left the terraces, stairways, and halls intact. No later society rebuilt the complex extensively. Erosion softened edges, but the stone framework remains legible. La Quemada does not resemble classic Maya or Teotihuacan architecture. Its form reflects adaptation to frontier conditions rather than imitation of southern models. The site represents a meeting point between cultural worlds, agricultural societies of central Mexico, and mobile groups of the north. Its architecture reflects tension, organization, and control, rather than openness. La Quemada shows how monumentality can emerge in contested landscapes. It demonstrates that large-scale construction was not limited to fertile valleys or river plains. The site's builders invested heavily in stone, permanence, and visibility. This investment suggests that La Quemada served as more than a village. It functioned as a regional center, coordinating movement, resources, and authority. The absence of written records means interpretation relies entirely on structure and context. Stone walls, stairways, and platforms preserve decisions made long ago. La Quemada records a society negotiating stability in a difficult environment. Its architecture emphasizes control of land, movement, and access. The settlement stands as evidence that complex organization reached far beyond the traditional heartlands of Mesoamerica. La Quemada remains fixed on its hillside, overlooking the valley as it did centuries ago. Its terraces still shape movement through the ruins, guiding visitors along the same paths once used by its builders. The site continues to raise questions, not through mystery, but through the clarity of its construction. Stone remains where people once gathered, governed, and eventually moved on. Theopetra Cave Wall. Theopetra Cave is located in the region of Thessaly, central Greece, at the edge of a limestone hill overlooking a wide valley. The cave mouth opens toward an exposed landscape shaped by cold winds, shifting climates, and long seasonal cycles. For tens of thousands of years, this cave offered shelter, but it also exposed its occupants to the elements. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Theopetra Cave. Human activity here spans an extraordinary length of time, from the Middle Paleolithic through the Neolithic period. Few sites in Europe preserve such an unbroken record of occupation. One of the most remarkable features discovered inside the cave is a stone wall built across part of the entrance. This wall is dated to approximately 21,000 BCE, during the last glacial maximum, when climatic conditions in the region were significantly colder than today. The wall is not monumental. It is low, roughly constructed, and limited in length. Yet its significance lies in intention rather than scale. Built from stones gathered nearby, the wall partially blocks the cave entrance. It does not seal the cave completely. Instead, it narrows the opening, reducing exposure to wind and cold air. This makes the wall one of the earliest known human-built structures designed specifically for environmental control. At the time of its construction, temperatures in Thessaly were far lower, and strong winds would have swept across the valley. The cave offered protection, but without modification, cold air could penetrate deeply into the interior. The wall altered airflow. By reducing wind speed and redirecting cold currents, it helped maintain a more stable interior environment. This was not architecture for display or ritual. It was practical, adaptive, and directly tied to survival. The builders did not use mortar. Stones were stacked and wedged carefully, relying on gravity and placement rather than binding materials. The choice of location was precise. The wall was placed where it would have maximum effect on airflow while preserving access to light and movement. This indicates planning and understanding of environmental dynamics, rather than simple piling of stones. The wall also marks a shift in how humans interacted with natural shelters. Rather than accepting the cave as it was, occupants modified it to suit their needs. This represents an early form of architectural thinking, altering space intentionally to improve habitability. Evidence from the cave shows continued use of hearths behind the wall. Fire and stone together created a controlled living zone within the cave. This combination of heat retention and wind reduction would have been critical during extreme cold phases. The wall was not a permanent feature across all periods. Later inhabitants modified or dismantled parts of it as climate conditions changed. This flexibility shows that the structure was functional rather than symbolic. It was used when needed and altered when conditions no longer required it. The cave floor preserves footprints, tools, and occupation layers that correspond with the wall's use. These layers indicate repeated return rather than brief refuge. The wall does not suggest ownership or territorial marking. It served the immediate needs of those sheltering inside. There's no evidence of social hierarchy associated with its construction. The scale suggests cooperative effort rather than specialized labor. The materials were local. The energy investment was moderate but purposeful. In contrast to later monumental walls meant to exclude others, this barrier was meant to protect those inside from nature, not from people. Its presence shows that early humans understood how built elements could improve living conditions even without complex technology. Theopetra Cave preserves a moment when architecture was born out of necessity rather than symbolism. The wall stands at the threshold between natural, shelter, and constructed environment. It represents one of the earliest known attempts to engineer comfort within a hostile climate. This structure challenges the idea that architecture began with agriculture or settled villages. Here, mobile hunter-gatherers were already modifying space deliberately. The wall also demonstrates continuity of knowledge. Understanding airflow, heat retention, and shelter placement requires observation over time. This knowledge was applied directly, without abstraction or formal planning tools. The simplicity of the wall is part of its importance. It shows how minimal intervention can have significant impact. Thiopetra's wall does not impress visually. It impresses through insight. It reflects a human response to climate stress during one of the coldest periods of the last ice age. The structure was not meant to last for millennia, yet it did. Preserved by sediment and later occupation, the wall survived long after its builders moved on. Its survival allows us to see architecture at its most basic, a response to wind, cold, and survival. The wall records a decision made tens of thousands of years ago to change the environment rather than simply endure it. This decision marks an important step in human history. Thiopetra Cave holds evidence not just of habitation, but of adaptation. The wall remains as a quiet boundary between open landscape and protected interior. It does not speak of power or belief. It speaks of shelter. Tel Karamel. Tel Karamel is located in northern Syria, within the Aleppo Governorate, near the Cake River Basin. The landscape here is gently rolling, with fertile soils and access to seasonal water. This region sits at the crossroads between the Anatolian Plateau and the Levant, a zone that supported human movement and experimentation long before agriculture became dominant. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Tel Karamel. Occupation dates to approximately 11,000–9,670 BCE, placing Tel Karamel in the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. This makes it one of the earliest known permanently occupied settlements in the world. At a time when most human groups were still highly mobile, Tel Karamel shows repeated construction, rebuilding, and long-term commitment to place. The most significant architectural features at the site are a series of circular stone towers. These structures predate similar constructions at Jericho and challenge traditional timelines of early architecture. The towers are built from locally sourced stone, stacked carefully without mortar. Walls are thick and solid, forming stable circular enclosures that rise above the surrounding settlement layers. These towers were not defensive fortifications. They lack parapets, arrow slits, or elevated vantage points suitable for protection. Their placement within the settlement suggests a communal rather than military role. The interiors of the towers are enclosed and controlled. Entry points are narrow, limiting access and movement. This indicates that not all members of the community would have used these spaces freely. Unlike later monumental buildings, the towers were not built once and abandoned. Excavation shows multiple phases of construction. Older towers were filled in and new ones built directly on top of them. This vertical rebuilding created a stratified mound, or tell, recording generations of architectural activity. The repeated rebuilding suggests continuity of purpose. Whatever role the towers served remained important over long periods. Domestic structures at Tel Karamel are smaller and more lightly built. Houses were constructed from stone foundations with organic superstructures, arranged loosely around open areas. This contrast highlights the towers as special buildings, set apart from daily domestic life. There is no clear evidence that the towers were religious temples in the later sense. No altars, figurines, or ritual deposits define them clearly as sacred spaces. Instead, they appear to have served as communal focal points, places for gathering, storage, or social coordination. Their scale implies cooperative labor. Quarrying, transporting, and stacking stone required coordination beyond individual households. This level of organization appears before agriculture was fully established. People were investing labor in architecture before food production became dominant. Subsistence at Tel Karamel relied on hunting, gathering, and early plant management. Wild cereals were exploited, but domestication was still in progress. The settlement's permanence suggests that architecture itself played a role in stabilizing community life. Stone structures created anchors in the landscape, encouraging return rather than movement. Fireplaces, work areas, and tool debris found near domestic spaces indicate daily activity clustered around the towers rather than separated from them. There's no evidence of strong social hierarchy. Housing remains relatively uniform, and burial practices do not show marked inequality. Authority, if present, was not expressed through elite architecture or wealth display. Instead, the towers may have functioned as shared infrastructure, spaces that belong to the community rather than individuals. The circular form is significant. It creates enclosure without directionality. There's no front or back, no axial approach. This contrasts with later rectangular buildings that emphasize hierarchy and movement. Circular architecture encourages gathering rather than procession. The tower's interiors would have been dark and enclosed, limiting visibility and shaping experience through proximity rather than spectacle. Their presence marks an early shift from purely functional shelters to buildings with social meaning. Tel Carmel demonstrates that monumentality emerged gradually through repeated modest acts rather than sudden innovation. These towers were not large by later standards, but in their time they represented unprecedented investment in stone construction. The site challenges the idea that agriculture drove settlement permanence. Here, architecture appears first. People built, returned, rebuilt, and stayed before full farming economies emerged. Tel Carmel preserves evidence of early communal planning without centralized authority. Its architecture records decisions made collectively, not imposed from above. The settlement does not show signs of rapid growth or collapse. Change occurred slowly, layer by layer. This slow accumulation reflects stability rather than expansion. Tel Carmel stands as one of the earliest examples of humans shaping space to support long-term social life. Its towers mark a turning point in how people related to place. They show that architecture began not as monument or defense, but as shared structure. The stones remain where they were placed, holding the outline of some of humanity's first permanent buildings. The site records a moment when living together became intentional rather than temporary. Tel Carmel does not announce itself through scale. It reveals itself through persistence. Wall of Jericho. Jericho lies in the Jordan Valley, one of the lowest inhabited places on Earth. The landscape is defined by heat, seasonal water, and long agricultural potential supported by nearby springs. For thousands of years, this valley offered rare stability in an otherwise demanding environment. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Tel es-Sultan. Occupation here dates back more than 10,000 years. Among its earliest monumental features is a massive stone wall and an adjoining stone tower, constructed around 8000 BCE during the pre-pottery Neolithic period. The wall is not a small enclosure. It is several meters high and built from carefully stacked stone. For a community without metal tools, animals for transport, or wheeled vehicles, this construction represents a major investment of time and labor. The wall does not surround a palace or temple. It encloses a settlement of modest houses built from mud brick and stone foundations. Daily life continued inside, while the wall stood quietly around it. Attached to the wall is a stone tower, one of the oldest known monumental towers in the world. It rises higher than the wall itself and contains an internal staircase leading upward through the structure. The staircase is steep and narrow. It was not designed for frequent traffic. Movement inside the tower would have been controlled and deliberate. The function of the wall and tower has been debated for decades. Early interpretations focused on defense, imagining the wall as protection against attackers. However, there's little evidence of organized warfare at this early date. Another explanation considers environmental protection. Seasonal flooding from nearby wadis could have threatened the settlement. The wall may have functioned as a barrier, controlling water flow and protecting homes. The tower's position strengthens this interpretation. Its base aligns with the slope of the terrain, suggesting it may have stabilized the wall or reinforced a vulnerable point. Yet the tower's height and internal staircase introduce another layer of meaning. From the top, the surrounding valley and horizon become visible. The tower transforms vertical movement into experience. Some researchers have noted that the tower aligns with the setting sun during specific times of year, particularly near the summer solstice. If intentional, this would make the structure one of the earliest known examples of monumentally framed celestial observation. This possibility shifts the tower's role beyond pure utility. It suggests that the structure may have held symbolic or communal importance alongside practical function. What makes the Wall of Jericho remarkable is not just its size, but its timing. This construction predates pottery, metal tools, and full agriculture. People were still transitioning from foraging to farming, yet they were already building at scale. The wall was not built quickly. Stone had to be gathered, shaped, transported, and stacked by hand. This required coordination, shared planning, and long-term commitment. Such effort implies social organization beyond family units. Decisions were being made collectively, and labor was being directed toward shared infrastructure rather than individual survival. The wall also represents a change in how people related to place. Instead of moving away from danger or seasonal change, the inhabitants of Jericho modified their environment to remain. This choice marks a turning point. Architecture becomes a tool for permanence rather than shelter alone. Inside the wall, daily life left subtle traces: hearths, tools, food, remains. Nothing about the interior suggests elite dominance or centralized rule. The monumentality exists without clear hierarchy. Over time, the wall was repaired, altered, and eventually fell out of use. Later generations built above and around it, bearing the structure beneath new layers of settlement. When occupation shifted, the wall was not remembered as a boundary. It became part of the mound itself. Its survival today is the result of abandonment, not preservation. What the Wall of Jericho ultimately represents is not fear, defense, or isolation alone. It represents a decision to stay, a decision to invest labor in stone rather than mobility, a decision to shape landscape rather than retreat from it. The wall and tower stand at the threshold between mobile human life and settled existence, between reacting to the environment and controlling it. They show that long before cities, states, or kings, people were already thinking in terms of shared space, shared effort, and shared future. The stones do not explain themselves, they simply remain, holding the outline of one of humanity's earliest experiments in permanence. And everything that follows in human architecture begins from that choice. Kirokitia. Kirokitia is located in southern Cyprus, near the Vasilikos River Valley, in a landscape shaped by low hills, dry slopes, and seasonal watercourses. The terrain is uneven and exposed, with limited fertile land concentrated along the riverbanks. Living here required close attention to resources and long-term planning. Archaeologically, the settlement is identified as Kirokitia. Occupation dates to around 7000 BCE, placing Kirokitia among the earliest permanently settled communities in the eastern Mediterranean. At this time, Cyprus had already been colonized by groups who crossed open sea, bringing animals, plants, and building traditions with them. Kirokitia is not spread across flat ground. It is built on a slope, with structures arranged in clusters that follow the contours of the hillside. Architecture here adapts to terrain rather than reshaping it completely. The settlement is defined by circular stone houses. These buildings are constructed from the local limestone stacked carefully to form thick walls. The circular form is consistent across the site, suggesting shared building knowledge rather than individual preference. Each house is relatively small, but walls are substantial. The thickness provided insulation against heat and cold, stabilizing interior temperature in a climate with strong seasonal variation. Roofs were likely made from organic materials, wood, reeds, and clay, which have not survived. What remains is the stone framework that anchored daily life. Interior spaces were carefully organized. Hearths appear near the center of houses, with storage pits and working areas arranged around them. Life was structured inward, focused on the interior rather than the outside. There are no streets in the modern sense. Movement through the settlement followed narrow paths between buildings, shaped organically by construction rather than formal planning. This dense layout limited open space and controlled circulation. It also reinforced proximity between households. Kirokitia is enclosed by a stone perimeter wall. This wall separates the settlement from surrounding land, creating a clear boundary between inhabited and non-inhabited space. The wall is substantial but not monumental. It doesn't rise dramatically, nor does it display defensive features like towers or parapets. Its function appears to have been both practical and symbolic. It may have controlled movement of people and animals, protected against erosion, or defined community identity. Inside the settlement, there is little evidence of social hierarchy. Houses are similar in size and construction. No structure dominates the others. This uniformity suggests a community organized around shared norms, rather than elite control. Burial practices at Kirokitia are closely tied to domestic space. Individuals were buried beneath house floors, placing the dead within the living environment. These burials are simple. Grave goods are minimal, reinforcing the impression of limited social differentiation. The placement of the dead beneath homes suggests continuity between generations. Houses became anchors of memory as well as shelter. Over time, houses were rebuilt on the same locations. Older floors were covered, and new walls rose above them. This created layered deposits that record long-term occupation. This rebuilding shows commitment to place. Families returned to the same spots rather than relocating. Subsistence at Kirokitia relied on early agriculture and animal management. Sheep and goats were kept, and cereals were cultivated, supplemented by hunting. The settlement's size suggests a stable but limited population. Kirokitia was not a growing town. It was a controlled community. The absence of large communal buildings is notable. There are no temples, towers, or central plazas. Instead, social life appears to have been distributed across households rather than concentrated in public monuments. This contrasts with later Neolithic sites where communal architecture becomes more prominent. Kirokitia represents an early phase of sedentary life where architecture served domestic stability rather than collective display. The choice of circular houses is significant. Circular forms are structurally efficient and create enclosed interiors without corners. This form encourages equality of space within the house. There's no front or back, no privileged position. The settlement's layout reflects repetition rather than hierarchy. Each house follows similar rules, reinforcing social balance. Despite this stability, Kirokitia was eventually abandoned. Environmental stress, resource pressure, or social change may have contributed. There's no evidence of sudden destruction or conflict. The site appears to have been left gradually. When occupation ended, stone walls remained. Organic elements decayed quickly, leaving the settlement silent but intact. Later, communities did not rebuild extensively on the site, allowing its layout to remain visible. Kirokitia preserves a moment when permanent settlement was still experimental rather than assumed. People here were learning how to live together in fixed places over long periods. The architecture reflects caution, repetition, and adaptation rather than ambition. It shows how early societies balanced stability with limited resources. Kirokitia does not present monumentality. It presents commitment. Every wall, floor, and burial records a choice to stay, rebuild, and continue. The settlement reveals how early communities organized life without leaders carved in stone or authority expressed through scale. It stands as evidence that permanence began quietly, house by house. The stones remain arranged as they were placed thousands of years ago, still outlining paths, rooms, and boundaries. Kirokitia holds the imprint of daily life, repeated over generations. It shows how architecture became part of routine rather than exception. And from that routine, long-term human settlement began to take shape. Perperkan. Perperkan is located in the eastern Rhodope Mountains of southern Bulgaria, within today's Karjali province. The landscape here is rugged and elevated, shaped by rocky ridges, narrow valleys, and exposed stone outcrops. The terrain naturally limits movement, directing paths along ridgelines and through narrow passes. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Perperkan. Human activity at Perperkan stretches back to around 5000 BCE, making it one of the earliest known rock-cut sacred landscapes in Europe. Unlike later cities built from added materials, Perperkan was shaped directly from living rock. Stone here is not used as blocks. It is carved in place. The site consists of terraces, stairways, chambers, basins, and platforms cut into bedrock rather than constructed above it. This approach required long-term planning. Once rock was removed, it could not be replaced. Every cut altered the landscape permanently. The earliest activity at Perperkan appears ritual rather than domestic. There's little evidence of early permanent housing. Instead, the focus is on carved platforms and open spaces. These spaces likely served as gathering and ceremonial areas rather than everyday living zones. The highest part of the site functions as an acropolis. From this elevated point, the surrounding valleys are visible in all directions. Visibility here is extensive, reinforcing the site's commanding presence within the landscape. Stone stairways connect different levels, guiding movement upward through the complex. These paths are narrow and deliberate, controlling how people approach the upper areas. Water plays a subtle role. Carved basins and channels appear throughout the site, suggesting collection of rainwater or use in ritual activity. These features were not added later. They were integrated into the rock from early phases, indicating that water management and symbolism were central concerns. The scale of carving increases over time. Early modifications are modest, while later phases show expanded terraces and more complex spatial organization. This suggests continuity rather than replacement. The site grew through repeated use rather than sudden transformation. By the Bronze Age, Perperkin had become a major ritual center associated with the Thracian peoples. Later traditions linked the site to oracular activity, though written confirmation comes much later. Even without text, the architecture implies restricted access to certain spaces. Not all areas were equally reachable. Some platforms are broad and open, while others are enclosed or difficult to approach. This spatial hierarchy suggests controlled participation rather than open assembly. Unlike settlements focused on domestic life, Perperkin emphasizes movement, elevation, and separation. Living quarters appear later, built around the carved core rather than replacing it. Stone walls were added where natural rock no longer defined space. These later structures adapted to the existing carved landscape, reinforcing the site's sacred continuity. Perperikon's architecture does not rely on symmetry. It responds to the shape of the rock itself. Walls follow natural contours rather than imposing straight lines. This creates irregular spaces that feel shaped rather than planned in a modern sense. Yet the repetition of carved steps, basins, and platforms suggests shared understanding rather than improvisation. Labor investment was immense. Carving rock with stone and early metal tools required sustained effort across generations. This investment points to long-term significance. Perperikon was not a temporary shrine. It was returned to repeatedly over millennia. The site's endurance is tied to its method of construction. By carving into bedrock, builders ensured permanence without maintenance. There were no bricks to erode, no timber to rot. The rock itself became architecture. Perperikon's role evolved over time. From early ritual landscape to fortified center in later periods, the site adapted while preserving its core. Even when defensive walls were added in antiquity and the medieval period, they respected the carved interior rather than replacing it. This continuity distinguishes Perperikon from sites rebuilt entirely in new forms. The carved spaces shaped behavior. Movement upward required effort. Entry into certain areas demanded intention. Architecture here structured experience rather than enclosed it. There's no single focal building. Meaning is distributed across the landscape. The site functions as a network of spaces rather than a monument. This distributed design reinforces the idea that ritual here was process-based rather than event-based. Participation may have involved movement, ascent, and sequential access. Perperikon challenges modern definitions of architecture. It is neither purely natural nor fully constructed. It occupies a space between landscape and building. The site records one of the earliest European traditions of modifying terrain for symbolic and communal use. Its builders did not separate sacred space from environment. They merged them. Perperikon stands as evidence that early societies understood stone not just as material, but as medium. The mountain itself became structure, memory, and boundary. What remains today is not a ruin in the conventional sense, but a shaped landscape. The cuts, steps, and platforms still direct movement as they once did. Perperikon preserves a long conversation between humans and stone, a conversation that began thousands of years before cities, writing, or states, and it continues, etched into the rock itself. Cairn of Barnenez. The Cairn of Barnenez stands on a rocky peninsula overlooking the Bay of Morlaix in Finistère, western Brittany. The coastline here is shaped by wind, tides, and exposed stone, with wide views across the sea. The landscape feels open and elemental, defined by rock and horizon, rather than shelter or enclosure. Archaeologically, the monument is identified as Cairn of Barnenez. Constructed around 4800 BCE, Barnenez is one of the oldest known monumental stone structures in Europe. It predates Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids by more than 2,000 years. At first glance, Barnenez resembles a long, low hill. Its scale becomes clear only when approached closely. The cairn stretches more than 70 meters in length and contains over 11 stone burial chambers connected by narrow passageways. Unlike later megalithic tombs built as isolated monuments, Barnenez is a composite structure. It was built in stages, expanded over time rather than completed in a single effort. This layered construction is visible in the architecture itself. Different sections use different masonry styles, reflecting changes in technique and planning across generations. The cairn is composed primarily of stone rubble and large slabs. There is no mortar. Stability comes from mass, weight, and careful placement. Each chamber within the cairn is accessed by a long, narrow passage. These passages are low and confined, requiring deliberate movement inward. The chambers are not uniform. Some are circular, others polygonal. Ceiling stones are massive, spanning small spaces with precision rather than scale. Interior surfaces are rough. Decoration is minimal, but carvings appear on some stones. Simple lines, axes, and symbolic shapes incised into the rock. These markings suggest intentional meaning rather than ornament. They are placed where they would be encountered during entry rather than displayed openly. The chambers were used for burial, human remains, and grave goods indicate repeated use rather than single interment. Bodies were likely placed over time, making the cairn a collective monument rather than an individual tomb. This collective use suggests a social structure where ancestry and group identity mattered more than individual status. The cairn's orientation toward the sea is notable. From the exterior, the monument looks outward across water rather than inland toward settlements. This positioning may reflect symbolic connections between land, sea, and the dead. The builders of Barnanez did not choose an easily hidden location. The cairn occupies a prominent ridge, visible from multiple directions. Despite its visibility, the monument does not dominate the landscape through height. Its presence comes from length and mass rather than verticality. Constructing Barnanez required immense labor. Thousands of tons of stone were gathered and transported, likely without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. This effort was sustained over generations, indicating long-term commitment rather than short-term ritual. The absence of nearby domestic structures suggests that Barnanez was not a settlement. It was a destination. People came here with purpose, likely during specific moments rather than daily life. The narrow passages and enclosed chambers shaped experience. Entry required lowering the body, adjusting posture, and moving slowly. This physical constraint would have heightened awareness and ritual focus. Light inside the chambers is minimal. Even today, darkness dominates once the passage turns inward. This darkness contrasts sharply with the open coastal landscape outside. The transition from wide horizon to confined stone interior is immediate and intentional. Barnanez does not contain a central chamber or hierarchy among burials. All chambers are integrated into the same mass. This suggests equality in death, or at least shared inclusion within the monument. The cairn was not sealed permanently. Its continued use required reopening and re-entry. This repeated access indicates that memory and interaction with the dead were ongoing processes. At some point, the cairn was deliberately damaged. Evidence shows that parts of the structure were dismantled or repurposed in later periods. This act does not appear accidental. It suggests changing beliefs or reuse of stone for practical needs. Despite this, much of the cairn survived, preserving its original form. Modern excavation revealed how complex the structure truly is. What appears simple from the outside contains intricate internal planning. Barnanez challenges assumptions about early Neolithic societies. At a time when agriculture was still developing, people were already investing in large-scale communal monuments. The cairn shows that monumentality did not begin with kings or states. It began with shared memory and repeated ritual. Barnanez records a long relationship between living communities and their dead. Stone here was used to hold presence rather than display power. The monument does not narrate history through inscriptions. It records time through accumulation. Layer by layer, chamber by chamber, the cairn grew. Each addition marked continuity rather than replacement. The structure remains fixed on the headland, exposed to weather and sea air. Its stones still define passages walked thousands of years ago. Barnanez stands as one of the earliest examples of architecture built to outlast its builders. It preserves not a moment, but a process of return, remembrance, and collective effort. And that process continues to shape how we understand the beginnings of monumental construction in Europe. Temple of Hera. Before marble became a symbol of Greek architecture, before perfection was carved into stone, there was a temple built to endure change. It still stands in fragments at Olympia, not as a ruin of failure, but as a record of transition. Archaeologically, the structure is identified as Temple of Hera at Olympia. Constructed around the 7th century BCE, it is one of the earliest monumental temples in Greece. Long before classical ideals took hold, this building marked the beginning of something new. The temple is located within the sanctuary of Olympia, a sacred landscape shaped by ritual, competition, and memory. This was not a city. It was a destination, entered periodically, not lived in permanently. The Temple of Hera was dedicated to Hera, one of the oldest Olympian deities. Her worship predates many of the gods later emphasized in classical mythology. The temple reflects that age. Its plan follows a familiar form, a rectangular building surrounded by columns, but its materials tell a different story. Originally, the columns were made of wood, not stone. Over centuries, as wooden columns decayed, they were replaced one by one with stone columns. No two replacements were identical. This gradual transformation is still visible today. The columns vary in proportion, shape, and detail. The temple records time physically, not symbolically. Unlike later temples built to appear perfect and finished, this one was always becoming something else. The walls were constructed from mud bricks set on stone foundations. This choice reflects an early phase of monumental building, when permanence was still experimental. The roof was heavy, made from terracotta tiles. Supporting it required careful balance between materials of different strengths. The interior housed cult objects associated with Hera, but it was not designed for large gatherings. Ritual occurred outside, around the temple, rather than within it. This outward focus emphasizes that early Greek religion was public and processional, not enclosed or hidden. The temple's columns formed a boundary, defining sacred space without sealing it off. Over time, the Temple of Hera became a central reference point within Olympia. Important objects were stored here, including ceremonial items used in athletic festivals. According to ancient tradition, the Olympic flame was later associated with the sanctuary, linking ritual, architecture, and continuity. The temple was never replaced by a newer, larger version. Instead, it was maintained, adapted, and respected even as architectural styles evolved around it. This restraint is important. It suggests reverence for age rather than obsession with innovation. Earthquakes eventually damaged the structure. Stone collapsed, columns fell, roofs failed, but the temple was not erased. Its remains stayed in place, embedded in the sacred landscape. Excavation revealed how early Greek builders experimented with form, material, and proportion long before standardized orders existed. The Temple of Hera does not follow Doric rules perfectly because those rules had not yet been written. This makes the building invaluable. It captures architecture in the process of becoming classical. Its imperfections are not mistakes. They are evidence. Evidence of adaptation, repair, and long-term use. The temple shows that monumentality did not begin as polished stone. It began with mixed materials, gradual change, and acceptance of impermanence. This structure was never meant to dominate the skyline. It was meant to remain. Standing quietly beside later temples, it reminded visitors that the sacred did not require novelty. The Temple of Hera preserved continuity in a world increasingly focused on perfection. Its uneven columns tell a story no inscription records, a story of early builders learning through repetition, of sacred space shaped slowly, not imposed, of architecture that aged alongside belief. The ruins still mark where ritual once gathered, not through grandeur, but through endurance. The Temple of Hera does not demand attention. It earns it through time. Tumulus of Bougon. The Tumulus of Bougon is located in western France, in the region of Nouvelle-Aquitaine, where gentle hills, open fields, and limestone-rich ground shape a quiet rural landscape. Nothing about the surroundings immediately suggests monumentality. Yet beneath this calm terrain lies one of the earliest and most complex funerary landscapes in Neolithic Europe. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Tumulus of Bougon. Construction began around 4800 BCE and continued over many centuries, making Bougon not a single monument, but a long-term architectural project shaped by repeated use, rebuilding, and changing practices. The site consists of multiple burial mounds, each with its own internal chambers, passages, and construction phases. These mounds were built using a combination of earth, stone rubble, and massive limestone slabs. The builders did not rely on vertical height to create presence. Instead, they created low, wide structures whose significance emerges through scale, weight, and internal complexity rather than outward appearance. From a distance, the tumuli resemble natural rises in the land, blending into the surrounding terrain rather than standing apart from it. Inside, however, the architecture becomes deliberate and controlled. Long stone-lined passages lead inward toward burial chambers constructed from carefully placed slabs. These passages are narrow and low, requiring those who enter to slow their movement and adjust their posture. The experience is shaped physically, guiding the body as much as the mind. The chambers themselves vary in form. Some are circular, others rectangular, reflecting different building phases and techniques. Ceiling stones are large and heavy, spanning small spaces with precise placement rather than decorative refinement. Stability is achieved through mass and balance, not ornament. Excavations show that these chambers were not intended for single burials. Human remains were placed repeatedly, over time, often accompanied by simple grave goods such as pottery, tools, and ornaments. This repeated use transformed each chamber into a collective space, where memory accumulated rather than concluded. The dead were not separated from the living by distance. The tumuli sit close to areas of habitation and movement, suggesting that these monuments were part of everyday landscapes rather than distant sacred zones. Interaction with the burial mounds likely occurred across generations, reinforcing social continuity. One of the most striking aspects of Bugan is the evidence of planning over long time spans. Some mounds were enlarged, reshaped, or reinforced centuries after their initial construction. Earlier chambers were sometimes sealed and new ones added, indicating changing relationships with the past rather than abandonment. This layered construction suggests that the builders did not see the monuments as finished objects. They were ongoing projects, adjusted to fit new needs, while preserving earlier structures within them. Architecture here functions as a record of decision-making rather than a single moment of creation. Transporting the stone used at Bugan required coordinated labor. Some slabs were moved from sources several kilometers away, without wheeled vehicles or animal traction. This effort reflects organized cooperation rather than individual action. There's no evidence of elite tombs dominating the site. Burial treatment appears broadly consistent, with no single individual marked by greater architectural emphasis. This suggests that status was expressed collectively rather than hierarchically. The mounds are arranged across the landscape in a way that suggests deliberate placement rather than random accumulation. Each tumulus occupies its own space, yet together they form a coherent funerary complex. Orientation varies between structures, indicating that symbolic meaning may have shifted over time or differed between groups. There is no single alignment that defines the entire site. The interiors are dark, even in daylight. Light does not penetrate deeply, reinforcing separation between the outside world and the interior space of the dead. Entry would have required intentional effort, making burial and visitation deliberate acts rather than casual ones. What Bugan demonstrates most clearly is that monumental architecture in Europe began not with standing stones or ceremonial circles, but with the careful organization of burial space. Memory, ancestry, and continuity were expressed through mass and enclosure rather than display. The tumuli were not built to be seen from far away. Their significance lay in their permanence and their repeated use, not their visual dominance. Over time, as burial practices changed, the site was eventually abandoned. The mounds remained, slowly blending further into the landscape as vegetation covered their surfaces. Modern excavation revealed how complex these structures truly are, exposing chambers and passages hidden for thousands of years. What appears simple on the surface contains intricate internal planning beneath. The tumulus of Bugan challenges the idea that early Neolithic societies lacked organizational capacity. The coordination required to build, maintain, and repeatedly modify these monuments indicates long-term social stability. These structures were not created in response to a single event. They were shaped by repeated decisions made across centuries. Stone and earth were used not to proclaim power, but to anchor memory. The monuments record a relationship between the living and the dead that was continuous rather than final. Bugan preserves evidence of a society that understood permanence long before writing, cities, or centralized authority. The tumuli remain fixed in the land, holding layers of human intention within their cores. They don't tell stories through images or inscriptions. They tell them through weight, repetition, and time. Nap of Howard. The Nap of Howard is located on the island of Papa Westray, in the Orkney Archipelago, off the northern coast of Scotland, where low cliffs meet the North Atlantic and farmland gives way to open sea. The environment is exposed and unforgiving, shaped by wind, salt, and cold temperatures, yet it is also stable. with long daylight cycles in summer and rich marine resources close at hand. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Nap of Hor, and it dates to around 3700–3500 BCE, making it one of the oldest preserved stone-built farmsteads in northern Europe. At a time when much of Europe relied on timber and earth for domestic architecture, the people of Orkney were already building permanent stone houses designed for long-term occupation. The settlement consists of two closely connected stone structures, often referred to as House 1 and House 2. These buildings were not isolated shelters, but part of a small, stable domestic unit that likely housed extended family groups over generations. The houses are low and compact, built directly into the landscape to reduce exposure to wind and cold. Walls are thick and constructed from local flagstone, carefully stacked without mortar. The stone was abundant and durable, allowing builders to create structures that required little maintenance once completed. This choice of material ensured survival in a region where timber was scarce and organic materials degraded quickly. The houses share similar layouts, reflecting standardized building knowledge rather than individual experimentation. Each structure contains a central hearth, stone-built furniture, storage areas, and sleeping platforms integrated directly into the walls. These features were not added later. They were planned as part of the original design. Interior space is organized inwardly, with daily activity centered around the hearth. Fire provided warmth, light, and a focal point for domestic life, especially during long winters. Smoke would have escaped through roof openings or permeable roofing materials, leaving traces still visible on stone surfaces. The entranceways are narrow and low, requiring occupants to bend slightly when entering. This design reduces heat loss and reinforces separation between interior and exterior space. Movement into the house was deliberate, not casual. The houses are connected by a short passage, suggesting close cooperation between occupants. This connection indicates shared activity and coordinated household life rather than strict separation between families. There's no evidence of defensive architecture. The settlement was not fortified, and its position does not suggest concern with conflict. Instead, placement reflects access to arable land, grazing, and marine resources. Subsistence at Nap of Hor relied on mixed farming and coastal exploitation. Archaeological evidence shows cultivation of barley, keeping of cattle and sheep, and use of marine resources such as fish and shellfish. This diversified economy supported year-round occupation rather than seasonal use. The absence of large communal or ritual structures is notable. Nap of Hor is purely domestic in function. There are no temples, monuments, or ceremonial spaces integrated into the settlement. Architecture here serves daily life rather than public display. This focus on domestic stability distinguishes Nap of Hor from later Neolithic sites in Orkney, where ceremonial architecture becomes dominant. Here, permanence begins with a household rather than ritual centers. Burial practices are not directly associated with the site. The dead were not placed beneath floors or within the settlement, suggesting a separation between living space and funerary activity. This separation contrasts with earlier Neolithic traditions elsewhere. Over time, the houses were repaired, modified, and reused. Floors were resurfaced, walls reinforced, and entrances adjusted, showing continued occupation rather than abandonment and replacement. The settlement was eventually buried by sand, likely due to shifting coastal conditions. This burial protected the stone structures, preserving them with remarkable clarity. When excavated in the 20th century, the houses emerged largely intact, revealing domestic layouts frozen in time. Nap of Hor demonstrates that long-term sedentary life in northern climates was already well established by the late Neolithic. People here were not experimenting with permanence. They had mastered it. The architecture reflects careful adaptation to environment, using stone to create insulation, stability, and longevity. There's no evidence of hierarchy or social stratification expressed through housing. Both structures are similar in size and quality, suggesting relative equality among occupants. Authority, if present, was not expressed architecturally. Daily life appears organized through shared labor and routine, rather than centralized control. The site's simplicity is its strength. Every feature serves a practical purpose, and nothing appears excessive or symbolic. Nap of Hor shows how early communities invested effort not in monumentality, but in durability and comfort. The houses were built to last, not to impress. They represent a phase of human history where architectural success was measured by survival through seasons rather than visibility across landscapes. Stone here is not used to mark power or belief. It is used to hold warmth, store food, and support daily routines. The settlement records a moment when home became permanent rather than temporary. It captures the transition from mobility to rooted life without the presence of public monuments or ceremonial focus. Nap of Howard stands as evidence that the foundations of settled society were built quietly, through repeated domestic choices rather than dramatic architectural statements. The walls still define space as they once did, guiding movement, enclosing hearths, and shaping daily life. The houses remain low against the land, resisting wind and time alike. They preserve a model of early domestic architecture that would shape northern Europe for centuries to come, not through grandeur, but through endurance. La Hougue B rises gently from the landscape of Jersey, one of the Channel Islands set between the coasts of modern France and Britain. The surrounding terrain is softly contoured rather than dramatic, shaped by low hills, fertile soils, and open views toward the sea. From a distance, the monument appears as a natural mound, blending quietly into farmland rather than asserting itself as a dominant structure. Archaeologically, the site is identified as La Hougue B. Constructed around 4000 BCE, it is one of the largest and best preserved Neolithic passage graves in Europe, and among the earliest monumental stone structures built on the island. The monument consists of a long stone passage leading into a terminal burial chamber, all enclosed beneath a massive earthen mound. The scale of the mound is deceptive. While it appears simple on the surface, it conceals a carefully engineered stone interior that required planning, coordination, and sustained labor. The passage is narrow and low, lined with upright stone slabs set with precision. Movement through it is constrained, forcing a slow approach toward the chamber. This restriction shapes experience, emphasizing transition rather than arrival. At the end of the passage lies the chamber, constructed from large capstones and side slabs that enclose a compact space. The ceiling stones are heavy, spanning the chamber with careful balance rather than structural redundancy. Stability here is achieved through placement and mass, not through decoration. The chamber was used for burial over extended periods. Human remains and grave goods indicate repeated entry rather than a single interment event. The space functioned as a collective tomb, integrating generations rather than isolating individuals. What distinguishes La Hougue B is its precise alignment. The passage is oriented so that during the equinoxes, sunlight reaches deep into the chamber, briefly illuminating the interior. This effect was not accidental. It required knowledge of solar movement and careful positioning of the structure within the landscape. The moment of illumination would have been brief but significant, linking burial space with seasonal cycles and reinforcing connections between the dead, the living, and the rhythms of the year. The mound itself was built gradually. Layers of earth and stone were added over time, sealing the chamber while preserving access through the passage. This process suggests long-term planning rather than rapid construction. The builders did not aim for height alone. They aimed for containment. The mound presses down on the stone chamber, creating a sense of enclosure and permanence. Transporting the stones required coordinated effort. Some slabs were sourced from locations several kilometers away, moved without wheeled vehicles or metal tools. This labor reflects cooperation at a community level, rather than individual initiative. There's no evidence of elite burials, distinguished by architecture. The chamber's design does not emphasize hierarchy. Instead, it emphasizes inclusion within a shared ancestral space. The monument occupies a prominent position on the island, visible from multiple directions. Despite this visibility, it does not dominate through vertical scale. Its presence is horizontal and grounded. This balance between visibility and restraint characterizes much Neolithic funerary architecture. Meaning is conveyed through placement and repetition rather than overt display. Over time, the site continued to attract attention. In later periods, structures were added atop the mound, including a medieval chapel. These additions reflect continued recognition of the mound's significance, even as its original purpose faded from memory. The decision to build on top of the mound rather than remove it suggests respect rather than replacement. The Neolithic monument remained the foundation. Excavation revealed how well preserved the passage and chamber were beneath the mound. The stone architecture retained its original form long after surface features changed. La Hugbi illustrates how early societies combined engineering with cosmology. Stone and earth were arranged not only to hold bodies, but to connect space, time, and memory. The alignment with the sun anchors the monument within a broader environmental framework. Burial was not separated from the natural world, it was synchronized with it. The passage grave format controls movement, light, and access. Entry was likely restricted to specific moments, reinforcing ritual significance rather than everyday use. The monument was not a place of constant activity, it was a place of return. Its architecture preserves the idea that memory was maintained through repeated visitation rather than permanent presence. La Hugbi shows that early island communities possessed both technical skill and symbolic awareness. Isolation did not limit complexity. The builders adapted continental traditions to local conditions, using available stone and shaping the mound to fit the island's topography. The result is a structure that feels both anchored and deliberate, rooted in place yet oriented toward the sky. The passage still channels movement as it once did, guiding the body inward and the gaze forward. Light still enters the chamber at specific times, recreating an experience designed thousands of years ago. The mound remains intact, holding stone, earth, and intention together. La Hugbi stands as evidence that some of the earliest monuments were not meant to be seen all the time, but only at the right moment. It preserves a form of architecture built around timing rather than permanence alone, a structure that waits, and continues to do so. Van Fortress. Van Fortress rises along the eastern edge of Lake Van in eastern Anatolia, where steep rock ridges overlook wide water and open plains. The landscape here is dramatic and strategic, shaped by volcanic stone, high elevation, and long sightlines across natural routes of movement. Any structure built in this position would have controlled visibility, access, and territory by its very placement. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Van Fortress, also known as Van Khaleesi. Its main phase of construction dates to the early 1st millennium BCE, during the height of the Urartian kingdom, a powerful Iron Age state that controlled much of eastern Anatolia, the South Caucasus, and parts of northwestern Iran. The fortress is not a single building, but a long defensive and administrative complex carved and built directly into a natural rock outcrop. The cliff itself forms the core of the structure. Stone walls, terraces, stairways, and chambers were added where the rock allowed, extending its natural defensibility rather than replacing it. This method of construction reflects Urartian architectural strategy. Instead of reshaping the landscape entirely, builders amplified its strengths. The rock ridge provided elevation and natural protection, while masonry walls closed gaps and defined controlled access points. The fortress stretches for hundreds of meters along the ridge, creating a linear stronghold rather than a compact enclosure. Movement through the site follows the contours of the rock, forcing approach along narrow paths rather than open ground. At the lower levels, massive stone walls mark the boundary between settlement space and fortress space. These walls are built from large well-cut blocks fitted tightly together, creating smooth, imposing surfaces designed to resist both erosion and attack. Above these walls, terraces step upward toward the citadel area. Each terrace served a different function, separating storage, administration, ritual, and elite space vertically rather than horizontally. Rock-cut stairways link these levels. The steps are steep and narrow, carved directly into the cliff face, limiting the speed and number of people who could ascend at any one time. This design emphasizes control rather than convenience. Within the rock itself, chambers were carved for storage, ritual use, and royal inscriptions. These spaces are enclosed and dim, shaped entirely from living stone. Their permanence contrasts with the mud brick architecture used in surrounding settlements. One of the most distinctive features of Van Fortress is its inscriptions. Urartian kings carved monumental texts directly into the rock face, recording construction achievements, dedications to gods, and assertions of authority. These inscriptions were not placed at ground level. They were positioned high on the cliff, visible from the plain below, reinforcing the connection between elevation and power. The fortress was closely associated with the Urartian capital of Tushpa, which developed at the base of the rock. Administrative, economic, and military life extended outward from the fortress into the surrounding settlement. Van Fortress functioned not only as a military stronghold, but as a symbol of centralized authority. Its scale and placement communicated control over land, water, and movement. The proximity to Lake Van was crucial. The lake provided resources, transport routes, and natural defense, while also forming part of the symbolic landscape of the kingdom. Religious activity was integrated into the fortress complex. Temples and sacred spaces were located within the fortified area, reinforcing the link between divine sanction and royal power. Unlike earlier prehistoric sites where monumentality emerged gradually, Van Fortress represents a mature state system. Planning here is deliberate, hierarchical, and coordinated at a large scale. Labor organization would have required state control. Quarrying stone, carving rock chambers, and erecting walls on steep terrain demanded specialized knowledge and sustained workforce management. Despite its scale, the fortress does not rely on decorative excess. Its impact comes from mass, position, and permanence rather than ornament. The stone surfaces are largely plain. Where decoration appears, it serves political or religious messaging rather than aesthetic refinement. Over time, the fortress was repaired, expanded, and reused. Later cultures occupied the site, recognizing its strategic value even as the Eurasian kingdom declined. The core rock-cut elements endured. Walls collapsed and were rebuilt, but the carved cliff remained unchanged. This endurance highlights the Eurasian emphasis on permanence. By carving into bedrock, they ensured that their architecture would outlast political change. Van Fortress does not dominate the landscape through height alone. It dominates through inevitability. Any movement through the region passes beneath its shadow. The fortress shapes perception as much as defense. From below, it appears inaccessible. From above, it offers command over space. This dual perspective reinforces its role as both barrier and center. Van Fortress marks a transition from prehistoric monumentality to state architecture. It shows how stone was used not just to remember or gather, but to govern. The site records how architecture became an instrument of administration, surveillance, and authority. Its walls and carved chambers preserve decisions made by rulers rather than communities alone. Yet even here, the landscape remains a partner rather than a backdrop. The fortress exists because of the rock, not in spite of it. The builders did not erase the mountain, they turned it into structure. Van Fortress stands as a reminder that early states express power through landscape as much as through armies. Stone here does not speak softly. It asserts presence through position and endurance. The cliff still rises above Lake Van, holding the imprint of a kingdom that once controlled the region through architecture as much as force. Its form continues to define space long after the state that built it disappeared. And in doing so, it marks a new phase in the human relationship with stone, land, and power. Persepolis, Gate of Nations. Persepolis lies on the Marvdasht plain of southwestern Iran, set against the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, where stone terraces rise above cultivated land. The setting is expansive rather than defensive, chosen not for concealment or protection, but for visibility and ceremony. This was not a city meant for daily life. It was a place built to be approached, entered, and remembered. Archaeologically, the complex is identified as Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, founded in the late 6th century BCE under Darius I, and expanded by successive kings. At the threshold of this complex stands one of its most symbolic structures, known as the Gate of Nations. The Gate of Nations occupies a carefully positioned space at the entrance to the terrace. Anyone arriving at Persepolis from the main approach would pass through this structure before entering the heart of the complex. Movement was controlled from the very beginning, guided through architecture rather than force. The gate is monumental but restrained. It consists of a large square hall with thick stone walls and high ceilings supported by massive columns. The scale is imposing, yet the space remains open and legible, designed to receive rather than intimidate. At the entrances stand colossal stone figures, often identified as lamassu, winged bulls with human heads. These guardians do not advance or threaten. They face outward and inward simultaneously, marking transition rather than defense. Their presence signals authority, but also order. The empire announced itself here not through walls or weapons, but through controlled passage. The inscriptions within the Gate of Nations are written in multiple languages, including Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. This multilingual presentation is deliberate. It acknowledges the diversity of the empire rather than suppressing it. The gate does not belong to one people, it belongs to many. The structure was designed to receive delegations from across the Achaemenid world. Envoys, tribute bearers, and representatives from distant regions would pass through this hall before proceeding deeper into Persepolis. This movement was ceremonial. Architecture shaped experience step by step, slowing pace, guiding direction, and framing perception. Beyond the gate, visitors entered a landscape of terraces, stairways, and halls designed for large gatherings and formal processions. But the Gate of Nations defined the tone. It marked entry into imperial space. The building's construction reflects advanced stoneworking techniques. Blocks are precisely cut and fitted, creating smooth surfaces and stable joints without mortar. The emphasis is on durability and clarity rather than decoration. Decoration, where present, is symbolic rather than narrative. Reliefs elsewhere in Persepolis show orderly processions of peoples bringing gifts, not scenes of conquest or violence. This absence is meaningful. Power here is presented as administration, coordination, and inclusion rather than domination. The Gate of Nations reinforces this message. It does not display trophies or defeated enemies. It displays guardians, inscriptions, and controlled space. The hall itself is neutral ground. It does not belong to the king alone. It belongs to the process of arrival. Movement through the gate was likely regulated, but not hidden. The structure is open on multiple sides, allowing light and air to move freely. This openness contrasts with fortified gateways elsewhere in the ancient world. The Gate of Nations does not seal off the complex. It frames it. The Achaemenid Empire governed vast territories with different languages, customs, and beliefs. The gate reflects this reality architecturally. It's not a barrier. It is a filter. Those who passed through were not entering a city, but a political idea made stone. The gate also marks a transition from the ordinary to the exceptional. Beyond it lay spaces reserved for ritual, administration, and imperial display. Yet the gate itself remains calm. Its proportions are balanced. Its surfaces are measured. Nothing is exaggerated. This restraint is consistent across Persepolis. Monumentality is achieved through scale and repetition rather than ornament. The Gate of Nations does not dominate the complex. It prepares the visitor for it. Over time, Persepolis was damaged and partially destroyed. Fire consumed wooden elements, and stone structures collapsed or were dismantled. The Gate of Nations survived in fragmentary form, its guardians fallen, its roof gone. Even so, its function remains legible. The layout still guides movement. The space still frames entry. Archaeological reconstruction reveals how carefully the gate was integrated into the overall plan. It is neither isolated nor decorative. It is functional symbolism. The gate stands as a record of how the Achaemenid state understood power. Authority was expressed through order, visibility, and inclusion rather than fear. The structure does not speak of conquest. It speaks of coordination. It reflects an empire that governed through systems rather than spectacle alone. Passing through the Gate of Nations was an act of recognition. To enter was to acknowledge the structure of the empire. Stone here does not command silence. It organizes movement. The gate remains a threshold between worlds, even in ruin. It separates open plain from formal space, ordinary ground from imperial architecture. The Gate of Nations holds the memory of arrival, not as invasion, but as procession. It preserves a moment when architecture became diplomacy, and in doing so, it reveals how stone was used not just to build, but to govern. Sanchi Stupa. The Sanchi Stupa stands on a low hill in central India, overlooking the plains of present-day Madhya Pradesh, where dry seasons and monsoon cycles have shaped settlement for thousands of years. The landscape is open rather than enclosed, allowing the monument to be seen from a distance without dominating the horizon. Its presence is steady and composed, defined by proportion rather than height. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Sanchi Stupa, one of the oldest and most important Buddhist monuments in the world. The Great Stupa at Sanchi was originally commissioned in the 3rd century BCE during the reign of Emperor Ashoka and was expanded and refined over several centuries as Buddhism spread across the Indian subcontinent. The stupa is not a building meant to be entered. It is a solid hemispherical mound constructed from stone and earth, enclosing sacred relics at its core. The architecture does not invite interior exploration. Instead, it organizes movement around itself. This distinction is central to understanding Sanchi. The stupa is not approached as a destination to be reached, but as a form to be circled. Ritual engagement occurs through circumambulation, a repeated movement that shapes experience through motion rather than enclosure. The dome rises from a circular base surrounded by a stone railing. This railing defines sacred space without enclosing it completely, allowing visibility while controlling access. Entry points align with the cardinal directions, reinforcing cosmological order. At the top of the dome stands a square harmica, from which a vertical mast rises, crowned by a triple umbrella form. These elements are symbolic rather than structural, representing stages of enlightenment and spiritual ascent. The stupa's surface is smooth and continuous. There are no reliefs carved into the dome itself. Meaning is carried by form and proportion rather than decoration. The most elaborate elements of Sanchi are the terrana, gateways positioned at the 4 cardinal points. These gateways are carved with detailed reliefs depicting scenes from the life of the Buddha, Jataka tales, and symbolic representations of Buddhist teachings. Notably, the Buddha is not depicted in human form. Instead, his presence is indicated through symbols such as footprints, wheels, trees, and empty thrones. This aniconic tradition reflects early Buddhist practice, emphasizing teaching over personification. The Taranas are not walls, they are frames. Passing through them marks transition rather than entry, reinforcing the idea that sacred space at Sanchi is defined by movement and awareness, not confinement. The reliefs are dense and continuous, carved across horizontal beams and vertical posts. Figures overlap and scenes unfold without strict linear sequence, encouraging contemplation rather than narrative reading. Craftsmanship at Sanchi is precise but not rigid. The stone retains a sense of softness, with rounded forms and flowing lines that contrast with the monument's overall solidity. Construction occurred in phases. The original stupa was smaller, later encased within a larger stone shell. This expansion did not replace the earlier structure, but preserved it within the new form. This layering reflects continuity rather than rupture. Each generation added to the monument without erasing what came before. The materials used were sourced locally, transported, and shaped with care. Stone blocks were fitted tightly without mortar, relying on weight and balance for stability. The stupa's design accommodates large numbers of visitors without crowding interior space. The wide circumambulatory path allows continuous movement, reinforcing communal ritual. Unlike temples dedicated to specific deities, the stupa does not house a cult statue. Its power lies in absence rather than presence. Relics at its core are not meant to be seen. Their significance comes from containment, not display. This architectural choice shifts focus away from visual encounter toward mental engagement. The act of walking becomes the act of worship. Sanchi was not an isolated monument. It formed part of a larger monastic complex that included additional stupas, monasteries, and ritual spaces built over centuries. These later additions respected the original stupa's dominance. Nothing eclipses it. All structures orient themselves around it. The site remained active long after Buddhism declined in many parts of India. Repairs and additions continued, preserving the stupa's form through changing political and religious landscapes. Even when the site fell out of use, its core structure remained intact. Unlike temples dependent on roofs and interiors, the stupa's solidity protected it from rapid decay. Modern excavation revealed how carefully balanced the design is. What appears simple is the result of precise planning. The Sanchi Stupa demonstrates a different approach to monumentality. It does not rise upward aggressively. It settles into the landscape. Its meaning is not imposed through height or enclosure, but through repetition and rhythm. Architecture here guides the body gently, without force. The monument does not command attention through scale alone. It sustains it through use. Each circuit reinforces presence, memory, and continuity. The stupa does not change with each visit. The visitor does. This relationship between form and movement defines Sanchi's enduring power. Stone here does not narrate history directly. It creates conditions for reflection. The monument stands as a physical expression of a philosophy centered on process rather than destination. Sanchi records how architecture can embody belief without representing it directly. It shows how space can be shaped to support inward experience without enclosing it. The stupa remains fixed on its hill, unchanged in purpose even as centuries pass around it. Its form continues to guide movement, as it once did, and in doing so, it preserves one of the earliest architectural expressions of Buddhist thought, written not in words, but in stone and motion. Los Milars Fortifications. Los Milars is located in southeastern Spain, in the arid landscape of Almeria, where dry riverbeds, low hills, and open plains define a harsh but strategic environment. Rainfall is limited, vegetation is sparse, and survival depends on careful control of land and resources. In this setting, Los Milars emerges not as a temporary settlement, but as a deliberately planned and heavily defended community. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Los Millares, one of the most important fortified settlements of the Copper Age in Western Europe. Occupation began around 3200 BCE and continued for nearly 1,000 years, placing Los Millares at the center of early social and technological transformation. The settlement occupies a promontory overlooking the Andarax River Valley. This elevated position provides visibility across surrounding land, while limiting access to specific approach routes. Geography here is not incidental, it is foundational to the site's design. Los Millares is defined by its fortifications. Rather than a single defensive wall, the settlement is enclosed by multiple concentric stone walls, reinforced with towers, bastions, and controlled gateways. This layered defense system is among the earliest and most complex in prehistoric Europe. The outermost walls curve with the terrain, following natural contours rather than imposing rigid geometry. Stone blocks were gathered locally and stacked without mortar, forming thick barriers capable of withstanding sustained pressure. Between the walls lie open spaces and narrow corridors that would have slowed movement and limited visibility for anyone approaching the core of the settlement. Defense here is based on depth rather than height. At key points, semicircular bastions project outward from the walls. These structures allow overlapping fields of observation and control, suggesting a clear understanding of defensive strategy. Entrance points are narrow and indirect. Approaching the settlement required passing through constrained passages rather than open gates, increasing vulnerability for outsiders and reinforcing control from within. Inside the innermost walls lies the residential and communal core. Houses are modest, built from stone foundations with organic superstructures. They cluster tightly, maximizing space while maintaining proximity between households. There is no evidence of monumental palaces or temples dominating the interior. Authority does not appear to be expressed through elite architecture. Instead, power is embedded in infrastructure. The walls themselves represent collective effort, coordination, and shared priorities. The scale of construction at Los Millares required organized labor over long periods. Quarrying stone, transporting materials, and maintaining walls demanded cooperation beyond family units. This level of organization coincides with the emergence of metallurgy. Copper tools and ornaments found at the site indicate early metal production and exchange. Los Millares was not isolated. It formed the center of a wider network of satellite settlements and burial sites, connected through movement, trade, and shared cultural practices. Surrounding the settlement are hundreds of Tholo-style tombs, circular stone-built burial structures used for collective interment. These tombs reinforce the idea of group identity rather than individual status. Burial practices mirror settlement organization. Just as walls enclose the living, stone chambers enclose the dead. The investment in fortification suggests concern with conflict or competition. Whether this threat came from rival groups, resource pressure, or internal tension remains debated. What is clear is that defense was not symbolic. It was functional and central to daily life. Los Millares represents a shift in how communities related to landscape and security. Earlier Neolithic sites emphasized openness and ritual space. Here, enclosure becomes dominant. The walls do more than protect. They define who belongs inside and who does not. Movement is regulated. Visibility is controlled. Space becomes structured around access. Despite this emphasis on defense, daily life continued within the walls. Cooking, tool-making, and social interaction occurred in close quarters, reinforcing interdependence. The settlement's longevity suggests that this model was sustainable for centuries. Eventually, Los Millares declined. The reasons are unclear, but environmental stress, social change, or shifting trade routes may have played roles. When occupation ended, the walls remained. Stone does not disappear easily. Erosion softened edges, but the defensive layout remains legible today. Los Millares challenges the idea that complex fortifications emerged only with states or cities. Here, organized defense appears in a prehistoric context without writing or centralized bureaucracy. The site shows that fear, competition, or strategic awareness can drive architectural innovation as strongly as belief or ritual. Los Molares records a moment when stone architecture became a tool for control, rather than memory alone. The walls transformed landscape into boundary. They turned geography into strategy. They marked a transition toward enclosed, defended life that would shape later urban forms. The fortifications do not tell us who attacked or why. They tell us that the possibility was taken seriously. Stone here is not passive, it is deliberate. The walls still trace the outline of a community that chose to stay, defend, and endure. They preserve a record of early collective action under pressure. Los Millares stands as evidence that monumentality could emerge from necessity as much as belief. Its fortifications remain etched into the hillside, holding the imprint of one of Europe's earliest defended settlements. And through them, the landscape still records how early societies learned to protect not just memory, but space itself. Mycenaean Lesser Tholos tombs. Across the hills and valleys of southern Greece, away from the monumental citadels and famous royal tombs, smaller stone-built burial chambers are cut into slopes and hidden beneath earth. These are the Lesser Tholos tombs of the Mycenaean world, structures that rarely appear in isolation, yet quietly define how death, memory, and status were organized across the landscape. Archaeologically, these tombs belong to the Mycenaean civilization, dating primarily between the 15th and 13th centuries BCE. Unlike the Grand Tholos tombs, often associated with elite centers such as Mycenae, these lesser examples were constructed for local elites, extended families, or regional administrators whose status was significant but not singular. The architecture follows a consistent pattern. A long, open passageway known as a dromos is cut into the hillside, guiding movement downward toward the tomb entrance. The passage is often narrow and lined with stone, forcing a slow, deliberate approach. This transition separates the world of the living from the enclosed space of the dead through movement rather than barriers. At the end of the dromos lies the staumion, a rectangular doorway framed by carefully fitted stone blocks. This entrance was sealed after burial but reopened repeatedly, indicating that the tomb was intended for long-term use rather than a single event. Beyond the doorway, the Tholos chamber opens into a circular domed space constructed using corbelled masonry. Stone blocks are laid in successive rings, each slightly projecting inward, gradually closing the roof until a single capstone completes the dome. This technique required precise understanding of weight distribution and balance. The Lesser Tholos tombs are smaller than their monumental counterparts, but their construction is no less deliberate. The domes are carefully proportioned, and walls are smoothed where effort was required, even though these spaces were not meant for frequent occupation. Light inside the chamber is minimal. Once the entrance was sealed, the interior became completely dark. The space was not designed for viewing, but for containment. The architecture emphasizes enclosure rather than display. Burial practices within these tombs were collective. Bodies were placed over time, often moved aside to make room for later interments. Grave goods such as pottery, weapons, jewelry, and seals were deposited, reflecting social identity rather than personal biography. These tombs were not isolated monuments. They were positioned within broader funerary landscapes, often clustered around settlements or along routes connecting communities. Their placement reinforced territorial association, linking families to specific land. The choice to build into hillsides was practical and symbolic. The earth provided structural support and insulation, while also reinforcing the idea of returning the dead to the land itself. Unlike chamber tombs carved directly into rock, Tholos tombs required both excavation and construction. This dual process increased labor investment and visibility, marking the tomb as a deliberate architectural act rather than a hidden cavity. The scale of labor required suggests coordinated effort beyond individual households. Quarrying stone, shaping blocks, and constructing corbelled domes demanded skilled knowledge passed down through generations. Despite this investment, decoration inside the Lesser Tholos tombs is minimal. There are no reliefs or painted scenes. Meaning is conveyed through form, repetition, and ritual use rather than imagery. The tombs were accessed periodically, likely during funerary rites or commemorative events. Each reopening reaffirmed continuity between the living and the dead. Over time, some tombs were abandoned, reused, or looted. Others remained sealed and intact, preserving their original contents beneath collapsed earth and stone. What distinguishes the Lesser Tholos? Tombs is their role within Mycenaean society. They represent a middle ground between common burials and royal monuments, reflecting a stratified but interconnected social structure. Power here was not centralized solely in palaces. It extended outward through networks of kinship and local authority. The repetition of similar tomb forms across regions suggests shared cultural norms rather than individual expression. Architecture reinforced identity through consistency. These tombs also reflect changing attitudes toward death. Earlier burial practices emphasized simpler chambers. The adoption of tholos architecture marks an increased emphasis on permanence and visibility. Yet, even here, monumentality remains restrained. The tombs are hidden beneath earth, visible mainly through their entrance passages rather than rising above the landscape. This balance between effort and concealment is deliberate. The tombs were meant to be known by those who belonged, not displayed to outsiders. The architecture shapes memory by controlling access. Knowledge of the tomb's location, use, and meaning remained within the community. The corbelled dome, though later celebrated in monumental examples, appears here as a practical solution refined through repeated construction. Each lesser tholos tomb contributed incrementally to the broader funerary landscape, creating networks of memory rather than singular points of focus. These structures record how Mycenaean society organized remembrance through architecture that was durable yet discreet. Stone here does not announce power. It contains it. The tombs persist beneath the hills, their domes still holding the weight placed upon them thousands of years ago. They preserve a way of thinking about death that emphasized continuity over spectacle. The lesser tholos tombs stand as evidence that Mycenaean architecture was not defined solely by kings and citadels, but by repeated shared practices across communities. Their forms remain legible, their construction sound, their purpose clear. They hold the imprint of lives remembered collectively rather than individually, and through them, the landscape of the Mycenaean world continues to speak quietly, long after the palaces have fallen silent. Tumulus of Bougon. The tumulus of Bougon lies in western France, in the region of Nouvelle-Aquitaine, where gently rolling terrain, open farmland, and limestone-rich ground create a landscape that appears quiet and unremarkable at first glance. There are no cliffs, no dramatic elevations, no natural features that demand attention. Yet beneath this subdued surface rests one of the earliest and most complex funerary landscapes built by Neolithic societies in Europe. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Tumulus of Bougon. Construction at Bougon began around 4800 BCE and continued for many centuries, making it not a single monument, but a sequence of architectural decisions layered over time. The site consists of multiple tumuli, each containing stone-built chambers and passages, arranged across a defined area rather than concentrated into one structure. Unlike later megalithic monuments designed to impress through height or visibility, the tumuli at Bougon are low and expansive. Their presence comes from mass rather than elevation. Earth and stone were piled deliberately, creating broad mounds that blend into the surrounding land rather than standing apart from it. The architecture is hidden rather than displayed. What appears from the outside as simple earthworks conceals carefully constructed stone interiors that required planning, precision, and sustained labor. Long passages lined with upright slabs lead inward toward burial chambers, shaping movement through restriction rather than invitation. These passages are narrow and low, forcing those who enter to slow down and lower their posture. This physical adjustment creates separation between the exterior world and the interior space of the dead, not through walls alone, but through controlled movement. Inside the chambers, large limestone slabs form walls and ceilings. The stones are not decorative. They are functional, chosen for size, weight, and stability. Ceiling slabs span relatively small spaces, relying on careful placement rather than architectural excess. The chambers vary in shape and construction technique, reflecting different phases of use. Some are circular, others rectangular, suggesting that burial practices and architectural preferences evolved over time while remaining within a shared tradition. Excavations show that these chambers were used repeatedly. Human remains were placed over long periods, often rearranged to make room for new burials. The tombs were not sealed permanently after use. They were reopened, accessed, and maintained. This repeated use transformed the tumuli into collective monuments. Identity here was not individual, it was ancestral. The dead were grouped, remembered, and returned to over generations. Grave goods found within the chambers are modest and relatively consistent. Pottery, tools, and simple ornaments appear, but there is little evidence of extreme wealth differentiation. Architecture, rather than material display, carried meaning. The effort required to build Bougon was substantial. Stones were sourced locally but still had to be transported, positioned, and supported without wheeled vehicles or metal tools. This work demanded cooperation across the community. The fact that construction continued over centuries indicates stability rather than short-term ambition. Bougon was not built in response to a single event. It was shaped by repeated decisions made across generations. Some tumuli were expanded, others modified, and earlier chambers were sometimes sealed and incorporated into later structures. This layering shows respect for the past without strict preservation. Memory was active, not frozen. The placement of the tumuli across the landscape suggests deliberate organization. They are neither randomly scattered nor rigidly aligned. Each mound occupies its own space while contributing to a coherent funerary zone. There's no central tomb dominating the site. Authority is distributed rather than concentrated. This absence of hierarchy distinguishes Bougon from later monumental burial traditions tied to elites or rulers. The interior spaces are dark and enclosed. Light penetrates only briefly during entry. This darkness reinforces separation between the living and the dead and emphasizes containment rather than display. Bougon does not present itself as a place for gathering crowds. It is a place of controlled access where ritual likely involves small groups rather than large assemblies. The monuments are positioned close to areas suitable for habitation, suggesting that the dead remain integrated into the lived landscape rather than removed from it. Memory and daily life coexisted. At some point, use of the site declined. The reasons are unclear, but changes in burial practice or social organization likely played a role. The tumuli were not destroyed. They were left. Over time, erosion softened their outlines. Vegetation covered their surfaces. The site became part of the land rather than standing apart from it. Modern excavation revealed the complexity hidden beneath these low mounds. What appears simple from above contains carefully planned interiors shaped by intention rather than accident. The tumulus of Bougon challenges assumptions about early Neolithic societies. It demonstrates long-term planning, architectural continuity, and social cooperation without centralized authority or written records. These monuments show that some of the earliest large-scale stone architecture in Europe was devoted not to gods or rulers, but to the dead. Stone and earth were used to hold memory rather than to project power. The tumuli record time through accumulation rather than inscription. Each layer marks another moment of return, another decision to build upon what already existed. Bougon preserves a worldview in which architecture was not meant to dominate the landscape, but to merge with it. The mounds remain grounded, quiet, and persistent. They do not announce their importance. They reveal it slowly through structure, repetition, and endurance. And in doing so, they offer one of the clearest windows into how early societies understood permanence long before cities, states, or monuments of display emerged. Ingapirca, lesser structures. Ingapirca is located in the highlands of southern Ecuador, in a landscape defined by steep slopes, cool temperatures, and wide Andean valleys shaped by elevation and seasonal weather. The terrain is demanding, yet predictable, requiring careful adaptation rather than large-scale transformation. Stone dominates the environment, and architecture here responds directly to that reality. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Ingapirca, the most significant Inca complex in Ecuador. While the Temple of the Sun often receives the most attention, the broader settlement is composed of numerous lesser structures that reveal how the site functioned as a lived and organized place rather than a single ceremonial monument. These lesser structures include terraces, retaining walls, storage buildings, pathways, and modest enclosures built from finely shaped and fitted stone. They do not announce themselves through scale or ornament, yet they form the connective tissue of the site, shaping movement, labor, and daily activity. The stonework reflects Inca construction principles adapted to local conditions. Blocks are carefully shaped and fitted without mortar, creating stable walls that resist seismic movement. Precision here is not decorative, it is structural, ensuring longevity in a geologically active region. Terraces are among the most widespread features. They follow the natural slope of the land, creating level surfaces for agriculture, movement, and construction. These terraces do not dominate the landscape. They stabilize it. Retaining walls support soil and redirect water flow, preventing erosion during heavy rains. Drainage channels are integrated subtly into the stonework, guiding water away from structures without disrupting the surface. Pathways connect different areas of the complex, guiding movement along deliberate routes rather than open ground. These paths regulate access and reinforce spatial order, ensuring that circulation follows intended patterns. Small rectangular buildings appear throughout the site, likely used for storage, administration, or housing for specialized workers. Their uniformity suggests standardized planning rather than individual construction. These structures are functional rather than symbolic. There are no carved reliefs, inscriptions, or decorative facades. Meaning is embedded in placement and repetition rather than imagery. The orientation of many walls and buildings reflects alignment with terrain and sunlight rather than strict cardinal directions. This flexibility shows adaptation rather than rigid imposition of imperial design. Ingapirca occupies a frontier zone of the Inca Empire. Local Canary populations lived here before Inca expansion, and evidence suggests that the site reflects cultural integration rather than replacement. Construction techniques show a blend of local and imperial methods. Some walls are more finely finished, while others use rougher stone, indicating phase building and varied labor groups. The lesser structures reveal how authority was exercised practically. Storage buildings suggest collection and redistribution of goods, while pathways and terraces organize labor and movement. Unlike ceremonial architecture meant to impress, these elements were designed to function continuously. They supported daily routines rather than occasional events. The absence of elite residences or palatial buildings within the lesser structures suggests that Ingapirca was not a royal capital. It functioned as a regional administrative and ceremonial center rather than a seat of centralized power. These modest structures also show how the Inca Empire maintained control across vast distances. Rather than imposing monumental buildings everywhere, it relied on repeatable architectural solutions. Stone terraces, storage units, and pathways appear across the empire, creating familiarity and efficiency rather than spectacle. The durability of these structures reflects long-term planning. Walls remain stable centuries after abandonment, not because they were monumental, but because they were well adapted to environment. Ingapirca's lesser structures do not compete visually with the Temple of the Sun. Instead, they frame it, support it, and make it usable. Without terraces, paths, and storage spaces, the ceremonial core would not function. These structures also suggest seasonal occupation patterns. Some buildings were likely used during specific periods related to ritual, agriculture, or administration, rather than permanent residence. The site does not show evidence of violent destruction. Abandonment appears gradual, likely following the collapse of Inca authority after Spanish arrival. Stone buildings were left intact. Organic elements decayed, but the framework remained. The lesser structures preserve a record of how imperial systems operated at ground level. They show administration not through text, but through space. Ingapirca demonstrates that power does not always express itself through large monuments. Often it's embedded in infrastructure. Terraces regulate land use. Walls define movement. Buildings store resources. These elements work together quietly, shaping daily life without overt symbolism. The architecture here does not demand attention. It earns it through consistency. The lesser structures reveal how the Inca Empire balanced central ideology with local adaptation. They show how stone was used to connect people, labor, and landscape into a functioning whole. Ingapirca was not built to overwhelm. It was built to work. Its smaller structures hold the logic of the site more clearly than its ceremonial centerpiece. They preserve the practical intelligence of Andean architecture, where survival, organization, and endurance mattered more than display. Stone here records a system rather than a statement, and through these modest walls and terraces, the rhythm of daily life in the high Andes still remains legible. Marae Taputapuatea. Marae Taputapuatea lies on the southeastern coast of the island of Raiatea in French Polynesia, where volcanic hills descend gently toward a sheltered lagoon and the open Pacific beyond. The landscape is defined by water, horizon, and movement rather than enclosure. Here the sea is not a boundary, but a pathway, connecting islands across vast distances. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Marae Taputapuatea, one of the most important ceremonial complexes in Polynesia. Its origins extend back to at least the early 2nd millennium CE, though its cultural foundations are older, rooted in oral tradition, migration, and shared ritual systems that linked islands across the Pacific. Taputapuatea is not a single structure. It is a complex of stone platforms, open courtyards, alignments, and ritual spaces built from coral slabs and volcanic stone. The architecture is horizontal rather than vertical, emphasizing ground, orientation, and openness instead of enclosure or height. The central marae consists of a raised stone platform facing the sea. Its form is simple, rectangular, and deliberate. There are no walls, no roofs, and no enclosed chambers. Meaning here is created through placement rather than construction. The orientation of the marae toward the ocean is essential. Ceremonial space is aligned with roots of voyaging, ancestry, and cosmology. The sea connects this site to others thousands of kilometers away. Taputapuatea functioned as a religious, political, and navigational center. Chiefs, priests, and navigators gathered here to establish alliances, perform rituals, and legitimize authority. Power was negotiated through ceremony rather than imposed through force. Stone at the site is not shaped for precision fitting. Blocks are placed carefully but retain natural forms. Stability comes from mass and arrangement rather than refinement. This approach reflects Polynesian architectural philosophy. The goal was not permanence through stone alone, but continuity through ritual practice. The marae served as a place where genealogies were affirmed and knowledge was transmitted orally. Navigation, astronomy, and seasonal cycles were reinforced through ceremony tied to specific locations and alignments. Certain stones within the complex held symbolic roles, representing ancestors, deities, or voyaging canoes. These stones were not decorative. They were active participants in ritual memory. The open layout allowed large gatherings while maintaining clear spatial hierarchy. Sacred zones were defined by elevation and placement rather than barriers. Access was controlled socially rather than physically. Knowledge of where to stand, when to enter, and how to move was governed by tradition. Taputapuatea was not used daily. It was activated during significant moments, reinforcing its role as a place of return rather than residence. The absence of domestic structures emphasizes this function. Daily life occurred elsewhere. Here, space was reserved for collective meaning. Over centuries, the site was expanded and modified. Additional platforms and alignments were added without erasing earlier elements, creating a layered ceremonial landscape. This continuity reflects respect for ancestry. New generations built alongside old stones rather than replacing them. Taputapuatea's influence extended far beyond Raiatea. Oral traditions describe it as a spiritual center linking Hawaii, Aotearoa, Rapa Nui, and other islands into a shared cultural sphere. This network wasn't maintained through writing or monuments of conquest, but through repeated ritual, voyaging, and shared cosmology. The architecture supports this role. It is open, adaptable, and legible to those who understand its meanings. Stone platforms here do not dominate the environment, they anchor it. The site's relationship with the sea reinforces the idea that space in Polynesia is defined by movement rather than fixed borders. Taputapuatea stands at a point where land and ocean meet, symbolizing connection rather than separation. Following European contact, ritual use declined, and the site was partially dismantled or neglected. Some stones were removed, others repurposed. Despite this, the core layout remained intact. The simplicity of construction allowed the site to endure change. Modern restoration efforts focused on stabilization rather than reconstruction, preserving the site's openness and original form. Today, Taputapuatea remains a place of cultural memory, rather than museum display. Its significance is still understood by descendant communities. The site demonstrates that monumentality does not require enclosure or height. It can exist through alignment, repetition, and shared understanding. Architecture here does not instruct through walls. It guides through orientation. Taputapuatea records a form of civilization built on navigation, memory, and connection across space. Rather than control of territory, its stones mark relationships rather than boundaries. They hold stories that are activated through movement and ceremony, not inscription. The marae continues to face the sea, unchanged in purpose even as the world around it transformed. It stands as evidence that some of humanity's most influential centers were not cities or capitals, but open spaces where knowledge, authority, and ancestry converged. Stone here does not enclose meaning. It holds it in place, and through that stillness, the wider Pacific world remains connected. La Bastida, defensive structures. La Bastida is situated in southeastern Spain, near the modern town of Totana in the region of Murcia, where dry hills and narrow valleys form a landscape shaped by scarcity and strategic movement. The terrain offers limited fertile land and clear lines of approach, conditions that place pressure on communities to control access, resources, and territory with precision rather than scale. Archaeologically, the site is identified as La Bastida, one of the most important fortified settlements of the early Bronze Age in Western Europe, associated with the Alargar culture and dating primarily to the early 2nd millennium BCE. Unlike earlier defensive sites that relied on simple enclosures, La Bastida represents a sophisticated approach to fortification that anticipates later military architecture. The settlement occupies a steep hilltop, rising sharply above the surrounding land. This elevation alone provides natural defense, but the builders did not rely on height alone. They reinforced the slope with carefully engineered stone walls, towers, and controlled access points that transformed the hill into a deliberately fortified position. The defensive walls at La Bastida are massive. Constructed from large stone blocks and rubble fill, they reach several meters in thickness, creating barriers designed to absorb impact rather than simply block passage. These walls were not symbolic markers. They were built to withstand sustained pressure. What distinguishes La Bastida from many earlier fortified settlements is the complexity of its defensive system. Rather than a single wall, the site employs layered defenses that work together to restrict movement and expose attackers to disadvantageous positions. Entrance points are narrow and indirect, forcing approach along confined routes that limit speed and visibility. Some gateways require sharp turns, preventing direct entry and reducing the effectiveness of force. Stone towers project from the walls at strategic intervals. These towers are not evenly spaced for symmetry, but positioned to cover specific lines of approach. Their placement suggests careful planning based on terrain rather than abstract design. The walls incorporate sloping bases and reinforced sections, features that increase stability and make undermining difficult. This level of engineering indicates knowledge gained through experience rather than experimentation. Inside the fortified perimeter, space is tightly organized. Buildings cluster along the slope, leaving little unused area. Movement within the settlement follows narrow paths, shaped by walls and terraces, reinforcing control even after entry. The defensive system does not separate military space from domestic space. Fortification and daily life are integrated, suggesting that security was a constant concern rather than a response to occasional threat. Construction required coordinated labor and access to resources beyond individual aid and households. Quarrying stone, transporting materials uphill, and maintaining walls over time implies centralized organization. This organization is reflected in broader El Argar social structure, which shows increasing hierarchy compared to earlier Neolithic communities. At La Bastida, architecture begins to express authority through control of space rather than monumentality alone. Despite this, there's no evidence of palaces or ceremonial centers dominating the site. Power is embedded in infrastructure rather than display. The defensive focus suggests competition over land, water, or trade routes. Southeastern Iberia during the Bronze Age was a contested environment, and La Bastida's fortifications reflect this reality. Unlike ritual monuments built to endure symbolically, these walls were built to function continuously. Repairs and modifications indicate long-term use rather than a single construction phase. Over time, the settlement expanded and adapted, reinforcing defenses where needed and reshaping access points as conditions changed. This adaptability highlights an evolving understanding of threat and protection. Eventually, La Bastida was abandoned. The reasons remain debated, but environmental stress, social change, or shifts in regional power likely contributed. When occupation ended, the defensive structures remained. Stone walls collapsed slowly, rather than being dismantled deliberately. Their remains still trace the outline of a settlement defined by vigilance and planning. La Bastida challenges assumptions that advanced fortification emerged only with later states. Here, Complex defensive architecture appears within a Bronze Age society without writing or standing armies. The site shows how architecture can record fear, competition, and adaptation as clearly as belief or ritual. Stone here is not passive. It is organized, directed, and purposeful. The walls do not commemorate victory. They anticipate danger. They transform landscape into controlled space. They mark a moment when survival depended not only on cooperation, but on exclusion. La Bastida's defenses reveal how early societies learned to think strategically about space, access, and permanence. They show how architecture became a response to pressure rather than expression alone. The hill remains shaped by these decisions, its contours still defined by stone placed thousands of years ago. The defensive structures do not speak loudly, they speak persistently. Through mass, placement, and endurance, they record how early Bronze Age communities negotiated security in an unstable world. And in doing so, they bridge the gap between prehistoric enclosure and the fortified cities that would follow. Gobustan stone structures. Gobustan lies along the western shore of the Caspian Sea in eastern Azerbaijan, where dry plateaus, exposed limestone ridges, and open horizons define a landscape shaped by wind, seismic activity, and long-term erosion. The terrain appears stark and minimal, with little vegetation and few natural shelters, yet it has supported human presence for tens of thousands of years. Archaeologically, the area is identified as Gobustan, a broad cultural landscape rather than a single monument. Human activity here spans from the Upper Paleolithic through the Neolithic and into later historical periods. Within this continuity, stone structures and modified surfaces reveal how people adapted to an exposed environment using minimal intervention rather than large-scale construction. The stone structures at Gobustan are subtle. They don't rise dramatically above the ground, nor do they form enclosed buildings or towering monuments. Instead, they consist of low platforms, stone alignments, terraces, and worked surfaces integrated directly into the natural rock formations. These features are easy to overlook. Their significance becomes clear only when viewed as part of a system rather than as isolated elements. Many of the stone platforms are formed by clearing and leveling bedrock surfaces, creating flat areas suitable for gathering, working, or ritual activity. Rather than building upward, the inhabitants of Gobustan shaped what was already present. This approach reflects a close relationship with the landscape. Stone was not treated as raw material to be reshaped completely, but as a surface to be adapted. Some structures appear as circular or semicircular arrangements of stones, loosely organized rather than tightly fitted. These arrangements do not suggest permanent enclosure. They suggest temporary use, repeated over long periods. The absence of heavy walls or roofs indicates that shelter was not the primary concern. Instead, these stone features likely structured social activity in open air. Gobustan's location near the Caspian shoreline would have offered access to marine resources, while nearby plains supported hunting and seasonal movement. The stone structures align with this mixed subsistence pattern, supporting flexible rather than fixed occupation. Stone tools, hearth remains, and worked surfaces indicate that people return to the same spots repeatedly, reinforcing memory through use rather than architecture. One of the defining characteristics of Gobustan is its rock art, carved directly into stone surfaces. While the petroglyphs often receive the most attention, they are closely tied to the stone structures themselves. The carvings are not randomly placed. They appear near platforms, terraces, and cleared areas, suggesting that imagery and space function together. The stone structures provided locations where people gathered, while the rock art recorded movement, animals, boats, and human activity connected to those gatherings. In some areas, shallow basins carved into rock surfaces may have been used to collect water or as part of ritual practice. These features are integrated into the terrain rather than added to it. The scale of labor invested at Gobustan is modest compared to later monumental sites, but its duration is immense. Small interventions were repeated over thousands of years, gradually shaping a cultural landscape. This long continuity suggests that Gobustan functioned as a stable reference point within wider seasonal movement patterns. People did not settle permanently, but they returned consistently. The openness of the site allowed visibility across large distances. Activities conducted here were likely communal and observable, rather than private or enclosed. There is no evidence of hierarchy expressed through architecture. No platform dominates others, and no structure marks exclusive access. Space appears shared rather than controlled. This lack of architectural hierarchy contrasts with later societies where stone construction increasingly expressed power and exclusion. At Gobustan, stone organizes presence rather than authority. The structures do not define boundaries, they define places. The relationship between humans and stone here is minimal but deliberate. Surfaces are cleaned, leveled, and marked, not rebuilt. This approach reflects an understanding that permanence does not require mass or enclosure. It requires repetition. Gobustan also lies in a seismically active region, with mud volcanoes and shifting ground nearby. Building lightly reduced risk, allowing adaptation rather than resistance to environmental change. The stone structures respond to this instability by remaining flexible and open-ended. Over time, as subsistence strategies evolved, the use of these spaces likely shifted, but the locations remained meaningful. Later cultures continued to recognize Gobustan as a place of significance, adding new carvings and marks without erasing earlier ones. This accumulation created a layered record of activity rather than a single architectural statement. Modern excavation and study revealed how these stone features relate to broader patterns of human movement around the Caspian Basin. Gobustan demonstrates that architecture does not begin with walls or roofs. It begins with decisions about where to gather, where to return, and where to leave marks. Stone here does not enclose life. It supports it quietly. The structures are not meant to impress. They are meant to endure through use. They show how early societies shaped space without dominating it. Gobustan preserves an approach to building rooted in landscape awareness rather than transformation. It records a long conversation between people and place, carried out through repeated, modest acts. The stone platforms and alignments remain exposed, unchanged in form even as their meanings accumulated. They hold memory, not through height or enclosure, but through continuity. In Gobustan, architecture is not separate from environment. It is embedded within it. And through these understated stone structures, one of the longest records of human presence in the region continues to remain visible, grounded in rock, horizon, and time.